didn't bring my headphones, so I have no idea what she said about me. I'm just trusting that it was kind. Thank you for inviting me and for the good organisation which has looked after me so far. I'm afraid I have to go today, so I won't be able to stay to the end, not because I don't want to, but that's life. Okay, I gather from all that was said, or the length of time that was said, that you've got the message that I'm very old. If you haven't, you can see that I am, and I've been at the work for a long time. And I guess I started with, well, 3 individuals I first met when I set up a play group for children who were then excluded from education, and even health didn't do anything for them until they reached the age of 7. So many of those children ended up in the back wards of hospitals. I won't go into the details of why we started, but it was a scandal that you'd like to think we would never see again. But sadly, we are now revealing things in adult care which are not far off that neglect that once featured some nearly 50 years ago in the UK. We are beginning to see terrible institutional effects of, again, once more. So I'm sad to think that I hope things improve while I'm still alive enough to see them. Okay, so we know that autism and intellectual impairment can go together. People used to think that the intellectual impairment was a result of the autism, and that somehow if you could get rid of the autism, then they would show that they all had good intellect. We know that that's not true, although having autism, as we've heard, does make it more difficult to give an accurate assessment of their potential. And so there are certainly some people who present as having more severe intellectual impairment than in fact they have as children. But undoubtedly, many people have both. And what's true is that it's the most intellectually able, those that Pat was just talking about, who actually, on the whole, become most socially able as they get older. And that doesn't apply to any other group. If you think about your friends, I've certainly spent a lot of my life in universities among very clever people, but they weren't always the kind of person you'd want to spend the evening with in a pub. Generally, being clever doesn't mean to say you're very sociable. But in autism, they go together. Why? Because people with autism, the main characteristic of autism is that they don't have the social instinct. They don't have those instinctual abilities. Human beings have very few instincts. They have some around sex later on. But the most important area of instinct is the early instinctual abilities that helps them to recognize themselves as a social human being and to relate to others of their species. Human beings are born with the most underdeveloped brain of any species. Most of the development of the brain happens after birth, which makes us very clever in a species because we can learn from our experience. Our brain develops according to that learning, but crucially, we don't have to usually do that by ourselves. The baby doesn't usually have to work out how the world works on his own. He's socially guided into that understanding of the world, and he has inbuilt instinctive characteristics that help that process develop. And it's because it's that that's missing in autism or disturbed in autism that makes it mean they are literally in a world of their own. That baby literally has to work out how things work for themselves. And if you imagine the complexity of that, you'll see what an incredibly difficult task it is. So it's not surprising that it's only those who have a lot of spare cognitive capacity who can use that to actually help them understand that social world. Okay. We've also got to look at, we've heard a lot about the diagnostic criteria this morning. You'll have noticed that most of it relates to behaviours. And that's a kind of frustration because we actually know that autism doesn't lie in the behaviour. It's not the behaviour that makes someone autistic. I have a friend with autism who I've learnt a lot from over the years, called Ros Blackburn, and she carries around, when she gives public lectures, chocolate bars in her bag. She's very fond of chocolate. And she puts out a challenge to the audience. She says, if you can tell me a behaviour that's unique to autism, you can have my chocolate bar. And as she says, she's never had to give it away yet. People with autism don't own certain behaviours. They share behaviours with others because they're human. And there's nothing that people with autism do that the rest of us don't do, given enough provocation. Okay. The key thing that affects autism is what underlies that behaviour. But of course, we can't see that. We have to hypothesise about it. We have to try and interpret that. But if we are to understand autism, that's what we have to do. We have to look underneath the behaviours to see what the causes are. The problem is that we're neurotypical, NT. So our agenda is a social one. We can't stop ourselves. You know, Ros says that, you know, for neurotypical population, well, our obsessional interest is social. And that's true, because that's how we're designed, because that's the most efficient way of existing in the world. And so our understanding of behaviour, when we see it, our interpretation is to interpret it in that social context. Because our experiences of our own development, our children's development, maybe our professional development, has all been based on the neurotypical. If we're going to try and look at it as coming from autism, we have no instinctual way of doing that. You know, people with autism are often accused of lacking empathy. Well, they don't actually lack empathy. What they lack is understanding. They don't know what we're thinking and feeling. But I suggest to you that though we're good at that with one another, as long as we come from a fairly similar culture, we're no better than they are when it comes to autism. We haven't got a natural, instinctive way of understanding autism. We have to use the cognitive route, just as they do with us. And of course, when we start using the cognitive route, it's not as natural, by definition. It's not as instinctive, by definition. And any stress, and we resort back to our agenda, which is a social one. So we often misinterpreting the behaviour, misunderstanding them, because we're using that social frame. So I get some of the work I do, I get shown a lot of behaviour support plans for children or adults. And even in specialist establishments that are supposed to be geared to understanding and working with people with autism, I see individuals described as aggressive. Can you be aggressive if you've got autism? I doubt it. To be aggressive, you've got to understand your own actions and their effect. You've got to understand the reactions of other people, and you've got to care. Most people with autism don't meet those criteria. They're violent, yep. But if we're calling it aggression, we're already misunderstanding it. We're already being misled by this behavioural definition of the behaviour. Much more common for violent behaviour as a cause is panic. Something's happened they weren't expecting, or maybe frustration, something's not happened that they were expecting. Panic is usually the first recourse when we're trying to understand behaviour, is to look at what panicked them, what could have caused the panic. And it will be something we weren't expecting because they have autism and different things will make them panicky. Or it may be that they just haven't learnt, they don't know adaptive ways of behaving. So they're behaving in a way that's non-adaptive. You know? I've seen children being accused of being aggressive because they go up and thump other children in the playground. But actually what happens when you thump a child and run off? They usually chase you to get their own back. One of the few social games that people with autism can enjoy is chase. So they learn to play chase early on. It's not the impulse that's wrong. It's just they don't know a better way of getting people to chase you, and we can teach them a better way. So it's focusing our teaching, focusing our efforts on what will really make a difference without assuming the social context that we often do. We also, especially in the adult world, value choice. Talking to a lot of workers in the field, they will often say the really important thing is to give them choice. Talk to a few adults with autism, and they hate choice. Choice makes them confused, it's difficult, it's horrible, they don't want choice. And they certainly don't want multiple choice. What would you like to do today? Oh, I don't know what I want to do. I don't know what's on offer. You know, if someone came, as they did at break time, and offered you a tray full of pastries, that's fine, because you know what they're offering you, a tray full of pastries, good. But what if someone had come up to me and said, what would you want, Rita? Ooh, I think I'll have, I don't know, George Clooney on a desert island, please. No, I wouldn't say that, because I know I'm supposed to be giving a lecture. You're not going to get George Clooney for me, and so I know you mean these pastries. But the person with autism doesn't automatically know that. If you're going to offer choice, you have to make it very clear what the choice is, what the menu is. Plus, they've got to have experience. Some of those pastries are not generally available in the UK. I have actually been to Spain quite a lot, so they weren't unfamiliar to me. But what if they were? What if I'd never tasted them before? Then that would be scary, wouldn't it? Do I want to choose one of these when I've no idea what they might taste like? It might be poison. I don't know. So I might refuse. Does it mean I'm making an informed choice? Does it mean I'm not hungry? No. But we need to manage choice, but we need to make sure that it's an informed choice. Too often people with autism, especially when they've got intellectual difficulties, are being assumed to making choices when they're not. They're on their own. Oh well, they've chosen to be on their own. Have they? You can only assume that if they know about friendship. When Ros first phoned me up, she was asking to talk to my students. And I already had someone doing that. So I said, well, you know, maybe, Ros, I will have to think about it because I already have someone come to talk. Who have you got, she said. So I named the individual. Oh, him, she said. Oh, he's got Asperger's syndrome. We don't want him. I've got autism. True autism. I don't want friends. That's her definition then. And for many years, she insisted that she didn't want friends. I don't know if she'd insist on that now because she has a number, and I hope that I'm among them. But when she first talked about friendship, her idea of friendship was like a spouse. She thought it would be somebody who'd hang around and you wouldn't be able to get rid of them. That they'd be part of your daily life. You'd have to share all your life with them, and that terrified her. So they need to know what a friend is. We had to teach her that it's okay to have a friend for different purposes. But we all have these. You have a friend you go to a music concert with. You have a friend you play bridge with. You have a friend you do such and such with. That's okay. Sometimes you make a mistake and you go on holiday with your bridge friend and you think, won't do that again. But mostly, it's okay. That's how we organise our life. There are very few people we meet in life we want to share every aspect of our life with. So we had to teach Roz that it's okay to have that kind of friend. And we also had to teach her polite ways of getting people to leave you alone without kicking them or pushing them out of your space. So you've got to remember also that we don't have mythical people with just autism, especially when they've got additional ID. Well, obviously, the fact they've got ID, intellectual disability, means they haven't just got autism, but often they've got lots of other things as well. So the difference between a lot of laboratory work, where we can, make sure that we're testing each variable independently, one at a time, when you're faced with reality, with real people, they've got a whole combination of things. So we have to accept that we're dealing with that combined effect. And there are big, as we've heard from Pat and from everyone so far, big individual differences. We need to help them learn about emotions. And emotions, you start understanding emotions by understanding your own. You can't understand emotions if you don't know what they are. Sadly, a lot of our emotional programs for teaching emotions, kind of jump a lot of stages. And they often start with recognizing emotions in other people. Well, that's a long way down the line. Emotions are represented in the brain in 3 different stages. And the first stage is, of course, general arousal. And people with autism definitely have that. In fact, they have very high levels of arousal associated with emotions, often quite extreme. And what makes their levels of arousal perhaps unusual and sometimes problematic is that they've often missed out, as again we've heard this morning, on the early mother-child interaction. One of the key things that babies learn in the process of that interaction is how to modulate your levels of arousal. If you miss out on that, you don't know how to do it. Colin Trevarthen, who did a lot of this work in Edinburgh, showed that, if you've got a mother who's desperate to have a baby, when the baby's there, they're right in that baby's face. Darling, and the baby has to close their eyes, turn away, till mum learns to calm down a bit. But then if mum's got a postnatal depression, she's actually not ready to interact. And then the baby does more work. The baby leans forward more, seeks out eye contact and things. Usually, of course, it's a wonderful balance. But as we know in autism, nothing wrong with the mum's side of it. It's the baby side of it. The baby is not able to time that, not able to join in. So that key skill of making and breaking eye contact, modulating levels of arousal, is missed out. So when people with autism get aroused, they really get aroused and they don't know how to make and break it. That's why programs that teach people with autism to look at you are horrifically bad. Don't ever do that. Teaching people to look at you without them understanding what they're looking at, without being able to make and break eye contact, means that you're making them vulnerable. Because there are only 2 situations in most cultures, including the Spanish one, when we stare deeply into somebody's eyes. One, of course, is the sexual come on. It's all right, it wasn't. Don't worry. And the other is aggression. What are you looking at? Both situations, they'll be giving out signals they don't know they're giving out, but it's going to make them vulnerable. So the last thing we need to do is to teach people to look at us until they know what they're looking for, until they've got a reason It's great if they look at us on their terms, but not if we teach them to look mindlessly. Then the next stage of emotional representation in the brain is when the hormone system's triggered. And then the hormones take place and your heart starts beating faster and your legs tremble and you're sweating and you're blushing or whatever, depending on the relation. People with autism have all that. Now the third level is when the amygdala is involved, a little horseshoe shape in the brain, which has many functions, but one of which is to connect the emotional areas with the cognitive areas. And we know that the amygdala is not functioning well in autism. Now that typically happens, that connection happens after 2. That's why you never bother arguing with an under 2-year-old, do you? Well, you don't need any sense, you learn not to argue with them, you just tell them what to do and help them do it. You don't have a philosophical discussion about why they should do it or not, you just get on with it. Most people with autism don't develop it anywhere near 2. They don't develop it till they're adult. Some never develop it, especially in this group with ID. And until that's developed, they can't recognize their own emotions, let alone recognizing other people. You've got to have that connection that helps you reflect on how you're feeling. You're feeling it, but you don't know you're feeling it. That means you can't label it for them. If you're teaching it, then we've got to choose situations when we're very clear about what they're feeling. That would be lovely if that was when they were happy, because it would be fun to teach children with autism to know when they're happy and to pick up happiness in others. The trouble with autism is that things that make them happy are not usually the same as the things that make other people happy. So you can't say, oh, it's your birthday, you must be happy. No. I came down, I expected to see my breakfast, and there was a box on my plate. And what's that got to do with anything? And people were singing at me, and it's just been a horrible day. So we have to pick the negative emotions. Sad, but you're more likely to be right if you settle on anger or fear than if you try for one of the more positive emotions. So we start with things, if we know the individual, we start with things that makes us certain that this person is, let's say, scared. As an example, Jeff Evans, who does a lot of outdoor education with both children and adults with autism, wonderful thing to do, as Pat was kind of suggesting. A lot of outdoor activities because they're very good at them, and it illustrates problem solving in a very concrete way. So it's a wonderful thing to do. Anyway, he was doing rock climbing with a young man with autism, and halfway up the rock face, this young man shouts out, "I hate jacket potatoes." Now you can think, well, that's weird, yes, but that the teacher knew that this young man actually didn't just hate jacket potatoes, he had a phobia about them. So you can think, well, what's there to be scared of in a jacket potato? That's weird, yes. That's a definition of a phobia, an irrational fear. I'm scared of moths. There's no good you telling me they don't hurt me. I know that. If I was scared of lions, it would be sensible. It wouldn't be a phobia. So other people's phobias are always daft, okay? But they're real. They're real, but they're daft. So the teacher knew that this young man was actually was scared of jacket potatoes. Now, what he was saying was not articulating, I am scared, because he didn't know he's scared. He's just got the same feeling that he gets when he sees a jacket potato. And in his day placement, when he shouts out, "I hate jacket potatoes," the staff come and take it away, and then he's relieved. So when he's feeling scared halfway up the mountain, he shouts out the same thing and hoping someone's going to take the fear away. So the teacher goes to him, and then, of course, because he knows he can't feel it himself, he can't feel his own responses, he has to do it outside in, as we often have to in autism. Look, your palms are sweating. Look, your heart's beating fast. Look, your legs are trembling. And you're halfway up a rock face. Because if you were sitting next to a gorgeous girl, it might mean something different. So you've got to take the context into account. You're halfway up a rock face, that means you're scared. And it's okay to be scared, because we can keep you safe and bring you down. Now, it's not one trial learning, they don't get it in one go. But if you do it in enough situations that are real, they begin to get the idea. And then you can give them better language for expressing that than I hate jacket potatoes. Okay. We need to help them see their own emotions if we're going to help them read it in other people. What we don't need to do is give them stylized versions of what emotions are. So imagine somebody who doesn't know his emotions. And Jim Sinclair is a very able person with autism, said he was in his 30s before he understood what emotions were. People would talk about them, and he was supposed to point them out in other people, but he had no idea what they were talking about. So imagine that you don't know what they are, and then someone shows you a picture of someone doing this and tells you this is happy, okay? And then like this is sad. Is it? Is it really? Imagine you've got autism with intellectual impairment and someone tells you this rubbish. You know, imagine going around the world looking for people like this. You might find somebody, but would they be happy? Probably not, probably demented, don't you think? It's weird. People do not look like this and they're happy. In fact, if they did, people with autism would be able to get it quickly. Because they look at the mouth pattern as it is, much more than the eyes, as we heard this morning. It's not helpful. I know it's difficult. It'd be nice if they could appreciate these symbols, but you can't appreciate symbols until you understand the concept. Then you can say, this means happy. But you've got to help them understand happy first. Okay. And then individual factors. It's 40 years since Lorna Wing and Judy Gould first pointed out that though everyone on the spectrum has a problem with social understanding, they're not all the same level of sociability. But we've done so little with that information. It's appalling that this very obvious thing is just neglected. So I can't say this is a result of research because I can't find people who are following my edicts enough for me to research whether they work. But these are things that I've used in practice and encouraged other people to do. If you remember Lorna's papers and her book, she identified 4 types of sociability. The first type was the withdrawn solitary child or person, adult, that Canna identified. Then she described the passive approach, or the passive stage, where someone will respond if someone approaches them, but they don't initiate social contact. Then you've got that wonderful phrase she used, which was active but odd. That's a group where they desperately want friends, but they don't know how to get it right, so they make mistakes. And then finally, she talked about, or in her later work, she talked about people being eccentric and sensitive. Now, we don't get much of that in the ID population, but I guess it's possible. Now, those stages are not fixed in life. This is this kind of person, but they often start off with one. They'll move through that spectrum because of teaching and training and experience, but they can go the other way. They can, say, start being solitary, withdrawn. They can move into being passive because they've been taught. They might even move to being active but odd. Then they hit teens or late teens, and they may become very anxious, and they go backwards. They become withdrawn again. So mental health difficulties mean they can go right back to being withdrawn and solitary. So what I'm suggesting in terms of our interventions is that it relates to their current situation, not to what we've described them as in the beginning, but what are they like now? And that needs to guide how we interact. So if they're withdrawn, they need some directive form of teaching. Not specifying what it has to be, but they've got to notice that they're being taught. If they're really in their own world, as it were, we have to intrude. So it might be a very behavioural structured approach, might be something like structured teaching, where the visually lays out very clearly what's happening to them, but they need to be able to see what's happening, what's going to happen next, and what the goal is. They need those things very explicitly. But at the same time, because they're withdrawn, they need a desensitisation programme so that they can tolerate other people. I'd like to say it had gone away, but sadly when I first started, and last year even, it reared its head again, there are people who say that people with autism, especially if they have intellectual disability as well, don't need anything special other than treating them as if they had intellectual difficulties. In fact, we had about a 4-month exchange in the British Psychological Society with letter writing, me just getting increasingly angry, but not really getting very far with somebody. And that was his point. He was saying that they often share behaviours, which is true. There are some behaviours which are shared with those with and without autism. There are some that are not, but still. And he said they have high rates of staffing ratio, and that's all they need. That is not the case. Because of that initial difficulty of tuning into the social world, because we're going to use social to understand their behaviour, they need people to understand them. So they do need some specialist understanding. Anyway, when I first started working in the field, behavioural methods were all that was on offer. And in the hospitals where I was working, there were people with very severe, multiple, profound intellectual impairment were being taught to do things like pull up their pants by 2 inches in the toilet, backward chaining. Now, we're talking about people here who will always need other people. And probably they will always need other people, especially if they've got profound difficulties, for the most intimate parts of their existence, for their personal care. Now, imagine if you're terrified by people. Imagine if you've so little understanding of people that when they come invade your space, you have to spit at them and kick them and try your best to get rid of them because you're frightened, petrified. What kind of care and quality of life are they going to have? We might be able to pay somebody to come and do the minimum, but it won't be done with love and concern and sensitivity. The priority for those individuals was not to pull up their pants by 2 inches. It was to learn to be comfortable with other people, and for other people, therefore, to be comfortable with them. And that's when one of my students, I developed with one of my students, the intensive interaction program, which the goal was purely that. Now, I'm not saying that's all they need, but I think it's part of what they need. That they may need behavioural programs to learn specific skills, but they also need to learn to be comfortable with other people, which is a gradual desensitisation program, and not having people suddenly invade their space for no reason, or a reason they don't know. Okay. Then, if they're passive, they're the ones who respond to interest. Either their own interests, no matter how narrow they are, or something that's just interesting. Gina Davis, who works with children, I admit, and their mothers, scours the joke shops and things to get just really fantastic, exciting, unusual things that rivet their attention. She's busy teaching joint attention through this means. But whatever it is, they need that interest to be triggered. But you have to go beyond that, because it's not enough, especially in this group, just to trigger their interest. They have to know how to get involved. So they have to have that interest triggered, and then you have to have the structure that shows them how to get involved with that activity. The active but odd group, they're the ones who benefit most from the rules, social stories and so on. They've also got to, of course, have experience, an experience with a buddy. Because I think listening to Pat once talk about her social skills group with much more able people. But one of the lessons she learnt, and I think the lesson we all learn who've been working in the field, is that you can get people to perform wonderfully in the lab, in a clinical setting, but out in the real world, it's as if you were never there. Why? Because people often revert back to what they typically do. Because like most of us, only more so, people with autism are creatures of habit. So just as I need the Weight Watchers lady as I reach for the biscuits to give me a slap on the hand, so people with autism need a buddy to remind them of the experience of putting things into practice. But we've got to be careful too for using social stories. They're great. But especially with this population who may well be taught a little script, may learn to say it if they can speak, but we don't always think how that's going to be interpreted. Because what may happen is they can say something but not understand what they're saying. And above all, not know how to get out of the situation. So often they give impressions because they've been taught all the steps to go through, that they understand more than they do, then they get into real difficulties because there's something they don't understand. So when we're teaching them how to manage in situations with something like a social script, we need to make sure we teach them to ask for help or to help them understand when they don't understand, because they don't know that either. And then maybe just a buddy. Okay. We need to use videos. For older people, for adults, we often use the soaps. Well, we used to. We used to use things like EastEnders. I don't know if anyone's seen EastEnders in the UK. It used to be quite good at illustrating anger and jealousy and all these things. But unfortunately, it's gotten rather violent and rather difficult now, so it's not very good at illustrating a good way to behave. So we've had to cut down on it a bit. But the good thing about using any kind of video material is that you can rewind. You can give that repetition that's needed in order for them to learn it, whereas you can't rewind typical life, which is how they can often learn from things. We need the SHEDS program. I don't know if you know the SHEDS program. It's like an adult version of Lego therapy. And actually, Lego therapy, in a sense, was derived from the SHEDS program. The SHEDS program is related to the fact that people with autism behave much more like men than women, even if they're women, if you know what I mean. You know, if you ask a man what he did last night, he'll tell you literally what he did. I went out to the pub, okay? And you've got to probe to find out who he went with. Nothing fishy there, he'll tell you what he did, because that's what you asked him, and then he tells you who he was with. Ask a woman, and she'll say, I went out with Jane. And then you have to probe to find out what she and Jane did. Not one better than another, it's just a different emphasis. Men typically, and people with autism definitely, do not sit round and talk about their emotions. Does that mean they don't have them? Does that mean they never share them? No. But it means that social context is alien. We found this in the UK, and we borrowed the SHEDS program from Australia, where they discovered it first. When Margaret Thatcher, you remember that dear lady, who closed down all the mining industries in the northeast. And we're getting a lot of suicides, mostly male suicides. So the local authorities were worried, and they set up some social support schemes to so the men could talk through their issues and not kill themselves. Unfortunately, the only people who turned up to these social support schemes were the women, which was nice, but not what they were after. So then they learnt from the SHED scheme in Australia, which was the fact that men learn or exercise their social cohesion through working together. That's how men relate. Not sitting around talking about how they're feeling, but doing things together. So the sheds, men like sheds, is where you do things. They set up various social projects. They repaired equipment for children with disabilities and so on. The key thing was, by doing things together, that then enabled them eventually to talk about their issues. Just as the Lego therapy for younger children helps them structure that social interaction, that's what we need to do for the adults with autism, is actually get things that they enjoy doing, help them do it with other people, and structure that so that they get some reflection on what they're doing. Okay. Well, I'll do that. Joint attention, crucial thing, very crucial when they're little and need to go to school, but also crucial in all our adult interactions. It's amazing how adults on this, with autism and ID are often referred to as being non-compliant. Usually it's because no one's attracted their attention. They don't know they're being addressed. People with autism have to be addressed specifically. As babies, they don't automatically know that their name is significant. They have to be taught that. Then when they go into school, they have to learn that we don't just always say, Jane, hang up your coat. We might say, everybody hang up your coat. And you're still Jane, but you're also everybody. And then you're Mrs. Brown's class, and then you're the blue group, and then you're, we expect children to swap identities so easily, which children with autism find incredibly difficult. And that difficulty is usually still there as adults. So even as adults, we need to learn, or the people working with them, or trying to set them up in some form of employment, need to know how to get their attention. And then we need to expand their words that they use to get their attention. But we've got to need to use it properly. My friend Ros, again, one of her special interests was trampolining. She loves that feeling of trampolining. And she's in there one day, bouncing up and down, enjoying that feeling. And her teacher has been working with her for a long time. She was an adult at this stage, working with her for a long time. But we don't always think, because it's so hard to think about autism. Comes into the room and without thinking says, it's time to get off now, Ros. Now, Ros has been trained to pay attention when she hears her name. So she heard her name, she paid attention, but the teacher didn't say anything else, so Ros went back to bouncing. Whereupon the teacher goes berserk. Look, if you're not going to get off when you tell you to go off, then you can't. Now, Ros tries to behave well in trampoline centres, because she doesn't want to be thrown out of them all. She's been thrown out of a few, but she tries to do as she's told. But you see, if only the teacher had come in and said, Ros, got her attention, and then said time to get off, or better still, just said get off, because that's clearer, Ros would probably have got off. She's not 100% compliant, but mostly she's trying to do as she's told. But in the teacher's head, saying time to get off now, Ros, is the same as saying, Ros, time to get off now. But for someone with autism, it can make all the difference in the world. Just teaching someone that simple thing of getting attention first, then giving the command, can make a big difference. But they need to know gestures. Some will develop speech, some won't. Regardless of their level of speech, we need to teach them common communicative gestures because they're important. We use them all the time, even if we don't realise it. Again, you may wonder if I've got Ros's permission to talk about her, and I have. Okay. And she talks about me, so it's okay. She was coming to talk to a group like this one day, and she was a bit early for a talk, and she was hovering about in the doorway, and the organiser saw her and said, "Ah, Ros, sit here," pointing to one of the seats in the front row that was empty. What did Ros do? And remember, she's actually got, as she says, average intelligence. She's certainly hasn't got an intellectual, though she was diagnosed with one when she was little, and she's got a lot of language. Not a lot of communication, but a lot of language. Anyway, she sat in the doorway where she was. Why? Because she knew what sit was. She knew what here was, which is where you are. What she didn't know was what that meant. Now, she was, I think, coming up to 40 when that happened. She'd known people like me for 10 years. Pat had worked with her for many years. And yet we hadn't picked up on that very, very basic bit of communication that was missing. And that caused her humiliation and, distress, because there she was sitting in the doorway when she was expected to sit on a chair. So it's trying to make sure that we teach very basic things, and including a lot of joint attention things. Look where I'm looking. It's so basic because you've been doing it since you were 5 months old. You can hold something up to a 5-month-old baby in the pram, and the baby looks. When you think about it, isn't that amazing? Think of all that stimulation coming into the baby, and yet they look at what you're holding up. Why? Because they've got an instinct that recognises that as a communicative gesture. An instinct that people with autism don't have. We have to teach them to look at things that you're holding up, to look at things that you're pointing to look at things that you're eye pointing to. And those, every day, in loads of ways, we're using these kinds of things and just assuming that they've got it when they may not. Later on, we come to label things like that. Look, here's a pointer. Look, baby, here's a pointer. I don't know why I was showing the baby a pointer, but there we go. But what if your child's got autism? They're not looking at what you're holding up. They're looking at your nasal hairs. So your nasal hairs become a pointer. And then we say, oh, people with autism have idiosyncratic reference. Yeah, because they don't know what you're referring to. All the stuff around, which aspect, which bit. What are you labelling? We have to be so clear and explicit when we're dealing with autism. Okay. So we've got to remember when we're supporting this group, often, especially if their behaviour is difficult, they get one-to-one support. They might even get 2-to-1 support. Imagine if the worst thing in the world to you is being surrounded by people. It's people invading your space. It's people hovering behind you. It's people, And then the more distressed you are, because then you're acting out your distress, the more people you get. And then people are surprised that your behaviour gets worse. Now you've got 2 people to get rid of. This is really hard. Very often, staff interpret what they need as more staff. A person starts behaving in a difficult way. Well, we need more staff. Needs to go on 2-to-1. Need to get almost the last thing they need. Fewer staff. Cut the staff. Cut the number of people in the room. Stop people hovering over him. Give him some space. It's counterintuitive because it's the way we typically work, because we're so socially oriented. And we automatically think what's needed is more social. No, less social. Let's get the social out of it. You ever thought why people with autism learn so much better from robots? Because with robots, they can understand it much more clearly. They can see the intention. They don't naturally see intentions. They just see behaviour. bit like us, really, but, you know, not really. Just brought home to me when I was working in Japan. And a friend from the UK sent a little anecdote in. These were children she was working with. But she was working on joint attention. And she was in an area where they have wheelie bins for collecting the rubbish. I don't know if you do in your area. But the wheelie bins had been put out and the lid had come off one of them and a squirrel had got inside and was pulling out the rubbish. Now, with this class of children with autism, the teacher had been working on look where I look where I point, and getting them to do the same thing, to point things out for other people, to comment on them, all those aspects of joint visual attention. So one of the children in the class pointed to the squirrel and said, "Oh, look, miss." Well, the teacher's thrilled. He's doing just what she's taught him. But then he said, "Somebody's thrown away a perfectly good squirrel." And I don't know how that translated, but it's the perfectly good that usually makes it funny. Obviously not in this case. But if you ask yourself what's he not understood, well, he's understood what a rubbish bin's for. And it's logically possible, isn't it, that you've got a squirrel in your pocket you don't want anymore and you've popped it in the bin. But clearly none of us would think that. It's not as if we think it and then think that's not likely. We don't think it at all. Because when we see people acting, or animals acting, we read intentions. We know that that squirrel is different from a robot squirrel. It's different from a puppet squirrel. It's different from a wind-up toy. That squirrel's got his own business. He's got some intention in going through that bin. That's what's missing in autism. And again, this is a group we have to actually illustrate intentions. So I've done it with sitting with somebody with a box of Lego and making a very simple little shape, and then scrummaging through the Lego box in a very exaggerated way until they cotton on to the fact that I'm actually looking for a particular piece. Getting them to help me, and they gradually understand that this scrabbling is not just scrabbling behaviour, it's scrabbling behaviour with a purpose. Because that's what we need to get over to them, that when we're doing things, there's a purpose. Just as we need to do things for meaning. Sad to say, it was one of my students I saw in action with a group of adults with autism and intellectual difficulty a few months ago. I've not seen him actually working. He scored very highly in his academic work with me. And this was his first practical thing I was watching. And he was apparently going to teach these 7 young men to clean a table. Not very inspiring, but, you know, quite a useful thing to learn to do, I guess, to clean a table. And he beautifully organised. They all had their own gloves and their own bowl and their own bit of cloth, and it was all hung up on their own peg, and it was wonderfully. And he came in, and there was a nice clean table, and the teacher, he'd showed them how to clean the table, using good teach methodology, top to bottom, left to right. Okay. Then sat down, and one after another, these 7 young men got up and cleaned the table in exactly the same way. Except, certainly by the end, could you say they were cleaning the table? Not really. Are they likely ever to clean a table or to understand what cleaning a table is? Probably not. They were following meaningless actions. You can't clean a table until it's dirty. It's pointless to get up and go over and over a clean table. How are they ever to understand why they would clean a table, or how are they ever to be prompted to get up and clean a table if you're not teaching them what it means? There used to be a horrible thing said about autism, that they don't look for meaning. Not true, not true. Human beings are meaning animals. We look for meaning, and people with autism look for meaning. They may not get hold of the same social meanings as the rest of us, but they also need meaning. And without meaning, life is terrible. Imagine what it's like being made to do something and you've no idea why you're doing it or what the purpose is. What's the most soul-destroying thing we give prisoners? You know, breaking up rocks when there's no reason to be breaking up rocks. If you want to destroy people, you take meaning out of their lives. And yet often that's what we're doing in autism. There needs to be a reason, they need to see the reason, and it's got to make sense to them. Not our reason, but a reason that they can understand. Okay. I don't know. Oh, I nearly got to go, haven't I? Oh dear. Right. Good to have schedules. Sorry. Some of these individuals are going to still be operating at a sensory level. So if we are having schedules, you've got to make sure that they relate to the level the person's at. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to follow or understand it. Now, there's a program called COM4, which was developed in the Netherlands, and it's for helping people move through those stages in meaning development and semantic meaning. So if they're still at the sensory stage, we need to communicate with them at that stage, but then we need to move them on to presentation stages. The presentation stage is where if you want a drink, you can ask for it by picking up a particular glass that's very near a water, you know, a jug of water or whatever. So it's very restricted, but you can do that. Then move from there to the representation stage. That's where one particular glass can mean any, you know, use any glass in different contexts and so on. In other words, it becomes objects of reference. Finally, of course, you would hope to move on to a linguistic system, whether it's sign language or symbol language or spoken language. But for the group that's still at the sensory level, and a lot of these individuals will be, we need to start where they are before we try and move them forward. Okay. Sorry about this. Right. Oh, one just good little thing I thought to tell you. Some people are puzzled by the difference between an obsessive compulsive disorder, in other words, when someone's doing something obsessionally, compulsively, and an autistic obsession. And I have a rule of thumb. Again, I can't point to any research that proves that I'm right, but it's proved useful. And that is, if the person is enjoying what they're doing, and it seems to get calmed while they're doing it, then that's an autistic obsession. If, on the other hand, they seem to be driven to do it, and they're not enjoying it, they can't stop themselves doing it, and it's actually making them more anxious, that's an OCD. And they need that treated as well as other things. Okay. Difficult to change behaviour. It amazes me the number of people try to change their own behaviour and don't succeed, and yet fondly imagine they're going to change their behaviour, these individuals with all their complex differences. Probably not. So I think, as Pat already said, the most successful things are those that change the environment around, that prompt the behaviour that you want, and don't rely on us forcing behaviour that we can't. Okay. Try not to make it worse. We often make it worse, unintentionally, of course, because when we see someone in distress, we go into their space. You know, we're very reluctant to back off. And backing off is often the best thing to do till things calm down. They can't cope with you when things calm down, and when they're so upset. We need to give them a calming things. I haven't got time to do that, sorry. Next time, just say something about restraint. It's become very unfashionable. A lot of our guides in the UK to treatment are saying that even forbidding it at one stage, you shouldn't use restraint. I sometimes see the consequence of people not managing behaviour, especially in self-injurious behaviour, which the group I'm talking about are particularly prone to. And I have an ethical position, which I teach all my students, and I think we should all adhere to. And that's, you should never allow someone to do to themselves something you would not let them do to others. So if you wouldn't allow them to bang somebody's head against a wall, you shouldn't allow them to bang their own. And I've seen the horrible, horrific consequences of people being allowed to hit themselves, become blind. Imagine what it's like being blind with autism and intellectual difficulty. And I know cases. And they're all because we don't want to intervene. It's a dereliction of duty of care if we allow someone to damage themselves. Of course, we should, if we have to use restraint, we've got to recognise that's a failure. We should have organised things so we didn't need to. But we're here now. We can't rewind the clock. We'll do better next time. But this time, we're here now. We have to have a safe way of managing people. The biggest problem with restraint is that we don't involve the person. That people with autism, their parents often are not even allowed to know what the restraint's going to be. As Ros says, why do you wait till I'm at my lowest, absolutely least able to cope, and then you pounce on me? Not surprisingly, she resists and finds it unbearable. She said, why don't you wait when I'm calm, in a good mood, and show me? Look, Ros, if you get out of hand, if your behaviour gets out of control, this is what we're going to do. We're going to hold you like this. This is what it's going to feel like. And when you calm down, we're going to let you go. Practice when they're calm. And then when you do it in a real situation, it's not so scary, not so frightening, and they can manage. Okay. Poor quality of life. What do we mean by it in autism? Well, you've got no decision. You can't make any decisions. No changes, so you don't get any development over time. You don't have an opportunity to increase your skills or understanding. And in particular, no adaptation to you as an individual. And that final goal's always got to be quality of life. A satisfying occupation, it doesn't mean necessarily a paid job, but doing something in the community. Clearing out ditches, doing it with other people, lots of opportunities. Ros has about 20 jobs a week. Some of them are quite highly skilled. She goes and gives lectures to people about her autism. But some of them are not. She actually cares for a man with cerebral palsy. She's a very good carer. She does all the intimate care needs of this man. She does his ironing as well and things. She's so horrified at the fact that I don't iron my sheets. She's even offered to come and iron them for me, but I don't allow that. I can sleep on a wrinkle, whereas she can't. Okay. So they need some understanding. They need informed choices. They need some positive experiences. You can't choose to do something if you don't know what it's like. And remember, when you're doing something new with people with autism, they won't like it to begin with. So you can't just try it once. You have to try it sort of 6 times. Then if you still don't like it, then we won't do it anymore. But they need time to get used to the newness before they can appreciate it. And education. Education doesn't stop. It's needed throughout life. I'm sorry I've overspoken. I'm going to stop.
Thank you.